Welcome to Fields of Consciousness, the podcast for consciousness conversations with myself, Jeffrey Stegman, and
Clayton Stedman.
As consciousness explorers and founders of Focus Life Force Energy, we're here to bring a holistic approach to consciousness and share practical examples of how you can take your life to the next level. From your environment to your thoughts, let's explore together how consciousness interacts with your everyday experiences.
In our last episode, we discussed the idea of a field of consciousness. In this episode, we look at several scales of consciousness, how they're used with kinesiology, and explore different ways to understand where your thoughts come from. Welcome to the podcast.
Welcome back to Fields of Consciousness. We're happy to have you with us. We're your hosts, Jeffrey and Clayton. Today, we're going to be looking into more detail about a specialized application of kinesiology, which is commonly referred to as consciousness kinesiology. And kinesiology is muscle testing in this case. We'll also be discussing different scales of consciousness. These tools are the foundations of our company, FLFE, Focus Life Force Energy, and how we create high consciousness fields. So we'll start talking about Dr. Hawkins' work, Dr. David Hawkins. And Clayton, you first introduced that to me. I had not heard of it before meeting you. And we can talk about some other scales that I had studied prior to learning about Dr. David Hawkins. When did you first hear about his work?
I first came across Dr. Hawkins' work or David Hawkins' work in probably 2003. I had a coaching practice at that time that specialized in where I specialize in business as a spiritual path. So I had a lot of, obviously, business people, and they were exploring ways to apply Dr. Hawkins' work to business, particularly measuring people's levels of consciousness, trying to check if the things they were doing were in the highest and best interest of all creation. Mm-hmm. And it was Power versus Force that everybody was reading at the time. And basically when I got into it, I started a study group with two friends of mine, and we really dug into trying to get the kinesiology testing to be consistent. Mm-hmm. So that was my first intro. And Dr. Hawkins, he's a longtime psychiatrist out of New York. He had a very large clinic at one time. I think he had 50 staff. I think it was the largest practice in the U.S. I've heard that. I don't know how I would find that out, but he was well known. He had a hospital build a wing of the hospital just for his patients. So he was, quite accomplished professionally, and personally. You can read in his books that he had when he was young. He was delivering papers, I think, in a snowstorm. I believe it's Wisconsin. And he had a near-death experience in a snowbank where the storm got so bad he had to try to just dig a hole in a snow cave, basically, and try to wait it out. And his father came and got him. And then later on, he went through his own spiritual journey, became an atheist for a little while, like many of us for a short period of time anyway, where we wonder why God would allow so much suffering, or what kind of God would allow so much suffering. And then, he became enlightened, and he was 43 years old. He had a major kind of life-threatening illness, and he was, lying on the table, so to speak, and he just asked that if there is a God, that would help him. And that was his turning point. Mm-hmm. So He's most probably well known now for originating the map or the scale of consciousness, and he's got lots of YouTube videos. So there's lots of information out there about Doc, as he's known. Yeah.
Yeah, we talked last episode about feeling in our bodies these fields of consciousness. And boy, I noticed it when I watched Dr. David Hawkins on YouTube. It's like his, field of consciousness around him is just transmitted through those videos, and I could just feel it in my body. It's like such peace, and my mind quiets. So it's great. It's a great thing to do, is to watch him.
If I'm ever having a hard time sleeping, I just read one of David's books, or watch his video, and usually about 20 minutes in, I start to really quiet down.
That's like if your mind's too active, you read the book. Yeah, that works for me too. And I find the videos do the same thing. Just have to wear your blue light blocking glasses if it's at night.
Yeah, exactly. Yes.
So what is the scale that he developed, Clayton, and the different levels in it? And I know they correspond to feelings. Could you tell me more about that? I'd love to hear your details.
Yeah, so Dr. Hawkins is maybe best well known for creating the scale of consciousness. It's a scale from 1 to infinity. And the scale is, the measurements are done using muscle testing, as you mentioned, Jeff, or as we also refer to it, kinesiology. The specialization of consciousness kinesiology is really the focus on measuring consciousness instead of using it to measure the appropriateness of supplements, or it's also used in chiropractic and other professions quite a bit. So basically it's, from 1 to infinity, it's logarithmic. So 2 on the scale is 10 times more powerful than 1. There is, in the human realm, it's 1 to 1,000.
And you can find Dr. David Hawkins, scale of consciousness or map of consciousness online, so you can see, the different levels and the corresponding emotions and view of the world, with those different levels.
Yeah. So on Hawkins' scale, shame is 20 out of 1,000. Despair is 50. So 150 is anger. 100 is fear, 200 is courage. That's where integrity starts on his scale. And then 250 is neutral, 300 is willingness, 400 is reason, 500 is love, 600 is peace and the beginning of enlightenment. And then 700 enlightenment ripens, and then that goes up to 1,000 in the human realm. Mm-hmm. So if you were thinking like, what is 150 or anger? Road rage is a pretty good example of that. Mm-hmm. There's, if you look at the scale of consciousness, you'll see in one of the columns that he talks about the emotions of each state. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So, it's very sort of common sense when you spend some time with it. Pretty accessible that way.
Yeah, I find it interesting that the really low levels, like despair, there's such low energy there, like depression, like people that can hardly get out of bed. And then once you get into anger, there's definitely more energy there. People start to act out. I mean, there was, in one of our webinars on the FLFE website, we talked about the history of consciousness, and we talked about during the last year and a half or so, and that period of the attack on the Capitol and the United States going to anger, and that kind of that feeling of anger. And so definitely more energy there. And then, so as you go up, you get more and more energy into those upper levels.
Yes. Sometimes the transition to the upper levels can be tiring because the body is adapting to higher levels of consciousness. And we'll talk about that in the future, about how to nutrify the body to help with the transition. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And yes, typically at the higher levels, there's more resources of every kind. Yeah.
So at each level personally, so you can look at the world, you can look at things other than a human. You can look at a place, like we've talked about in previous episode, how a place feels, that you could use kinesiology then to measure the level of consciousness of that place. And, something that was at 50 or really low would, feel really kind of heavy and low energy, where those pilgrimage place spots or cathedrals would have that kind of elevated feeling of energy and a high level of consciousness.
Yeah, on a real practical day-to-day level, if you've ever been to an old battlefield, many of them have that heaviness still there. Mm-hmm. If people do prayers and blessings or different things to raise the energy, the memory will still be on the land, but the trauma won't be there. Mm-hmm. So you can have a place where there was a war that could calibrate at 400 or 500 that land, and the trauma would not be there, but you would still be able to access the memory if you know how to do that. So it's it's a really interesting study, and it's very, it's just very common sense. Most of us like to be around kind people. Anger's, it gets a bit old. It gets a bit kind of repulsive. And, anger is an easy place to get stuck in, especially when you're frustrated with the way the world is, or even yourself in it. It's something, I think it's something we all have to grow through.
Yeah. And so personal LOC, or personal level of consciousness, would say you're in anger, or you're in maybe unconditional love, say at 540 to 560, which is where the FLFE environment is. Say you're in unconditional love, it's more fun to talk about than being in anger. That it's how you see the world then. So you're at this level of unconditional love, you just love everything. And so that's this, like wearing rose-colored glasses maybe comes from. It's like everybody looks like, lovable. Everything looks lovable.
There's a term called Pollyanna that's coming to mind. They just see everybody as, everybody's doing the best they can. Everybody's trying, and everybody's a good person inside, and they're just, they've lost their way for a while. And, at anger, everybody's wrong, It's like, all the drivers on the road are horrible. When we got road rage. At anger, the world is not a safe place. Yeah.
And in the Winnie the Pooh books and cartoons, there was Eeyore, which was always had a dark cloud over his head. He was just always depressed, and everything was bad and wrong. He's an example of somebody that's in that like despair level of consciousness, and he'd just drag around, he would just walk very slowly and, talk very slowly. So it was a great example of someone in that level.
Yeah. When you mentioned Eeyore the other day, and I remembered it was a donkey from Winnie the Pooh, and forever after my perception of donkeys has been skewed. I know they're kind of stubborn and slow, but it's like, oh my God, that's where I got that from, is from Eeyore, Winnie the Pooh. So,
yeah, I've met some nice donkeys along the way.
Yeah, so there's the idea of scales isn't new to probably anybody listening to this. There's scales in school. You get a grade, right? A scale of 1 to 100. But you've explored some other scales, Jeff. Why don't you talk about some of those, and maybe other people have studied those as well?
Yeah, before we met, Clayton, and before I learned about Dr. David Hawkins, I was studying Ken Wilber's work and went to Denver and did some courses there with him and other people in his organization. And spiral dynamics was a scale that they were using, and spiral dynamics integral sort of takes in the integral theory that Ken Wilber has brought to us. And in spiral dynamics, it is sort of map-like. They show these transitions, and they call it an evolution of memes or worldviews. So it's like different colored glasses, like we were just talking about along the way. So there's different worldviews as you evolve. And Don Beck Don Beck was one of the authors of that originally, and took it further into integral. And Ken Wilber's work really is wrapped around levels of consciousness, what he calls in lines, different areas of your consciousness or different areas of your life, and levels of consciousness using the spiral dynamics map. And then states of consciousness, which would be more short term, like a meditation event or, workshop you went to. Robert Keegan was someone else that I learned from Ken Wilber. He's a Harvard psychologist, and he also studied levels of consciousness, and there were 5 kind of evolution or stages, or what he calls them orders of consciousness. So it's interesting. I was already studying like levels of consciousness and really sort of into it, and seeing how it really does describe the world and how people act and why someone sees the world the way they do. And then once you introduced me to Dr. David Hawkins, it just got even to a deeper, much more concrete level for me, because with kinesiology you can measure consciousness. So at the end of the episode, we'll talk about more concrete, sort of practical ways to manage your thoughts and give yourself more freedom. And that's kind of related to the last episode. And your thoughts may not be your thoughts; they may be coming from somewhere else. So that's something we'll touch upon later and at the end of the episode.
And Jeff, didn't you do some work with cultural transition consultants, where they were bringing in different aspects of consciousness into your companies?
Well, spiral dynamics was really helpful there, because in spiral dynamics, you see the world in a certain way. And when you're in, say, red, what they call red, and this corresponds to the chakra levels, you're very independent. And if you only respect strength, somebody's more of a badass than you are. And so when you talk to someone like that, you have to be strong. You can't please, and you have to be in their face. And the Army has been really good at taking people at those levels of consciousness and moving them into more respect for authority. And then you have other people who respect authority, and they're in the pyramid of, the chain of command, and they want to be told what to do. So you talking to that kind of someone in that level, you want to tell them what to do, because if you don't, and you just discuss it, and what do you think? There's of course subtle levels of this, but we use it in these transitions for how to speak to someone where they are, like meet them where they are, how they see the world. And then if you get into green in that scale, it's more, you want to talk everything. Everybody gets a voice, and you talk through everything, and it's a much longer decision-making process, but everybody's on board. So so that's how we used it in the business, was to really understand where people come from and how they see the world, and how they can get on board with the changes that were happening, and really be excited about it.
Yeah, this is real practical stuff we're talking about. And if you have a high intent towards the people you work with, and you're in service to your customers, and generally in service to others rather than service to self, you're likely going to come across or be working with some type of scale of consciousness that you're trying to move through.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's part of just connecting to people in a way that's real for them and real for you, is that understanding where they are, so you can really, really get to a real conversation, not be talking down to someone or up to someone, or it's being in a business and running a consciousness a business, is a spiritual path, as we talk about in FLFE. It's really meeting people where they are. So, Clayton, what is muscle testing? So we talked about kinesiology being muscle testing. How do you do that? I see you with your hand, off to the side sometimes. Explain to us how you personally do it.
Well, muscle testing is based upon the premise that we're connected to all that is. We're connected to the universe. Mm-hmm. And it's a way for us to bypass the mind. Mm-hmm. We have to use the mind in forming the inquiry or asking the question. It's really a question in a form of a declarative statement. But it's just recognizing that the muscle will stay strong or go strong with a positive statement, and will go weak around a negative statement. It will also go weak around a negative stimulus. So if you're thinking of buying something in the supermarket and you want to know if it's healthy for your body or not, you can just hold it in front of your solar plexus, and like I have some Post-it notes here. If I just hold it in front of my solar plexus and say, this is an appropriate food for my body, you'll go backwards for no and forwards for yes. Mm-hmm. So it's just the body's own innate intelligence moving in a certain direction. And then you could get into scaling things. So scaling is interesting. We use scale. We grew up with scaling in school. You get an A, it's 80% or higher. I think a B is 70, a C is 60. It's been a long time since I've been in school, but pretty sure that's right. And then we use a lot of scaling and FLFE to test the variables and optimizing the environment. And we use things called parallel scales. So we use the Hawkins scale of consciousness quite a bit. And then we'll use a scale parallel to the Hawkins scale of consciousness, where 1000 represents another factor. And so that way you're using all the logarithmic aspects of the scale, and you're using all of the research and resourcefulness that is in that whole body of work. And the scale of consciousness is very well researched, and then you can look at how appropriate different things are, and it becomes really helpful. And you can also use a percentage scale. Percentage scales aren't as accurate unless you redefine the scale where 100 represents being in the ultimate alignment with divinity. Mm-hmm. Because any scale that doesn't have divinity as the ultimate source of truth, or all that is, or the universal intelligence, whatever you want to, some people call it God, whatever you call it. If a scale doesn't have that as the ultimate truth, it limits the level of consciousness of the scale, which increases the variability in your answers. Mm-hmm. So that's really important when you're looking at scales, is to find the highest consciousness scale that you can. Mm-hmm. And, we'll talk about that in future episodes in probably more detail.
Yeah, I like the logarithmic aspect of the scale too, of the Hawkins scale, in that, it's 10 times more for each point upwards. So when I'm looking at appropriateness of food, I'm in the supermarket. In that case, I use the heart expansion and contraction that we talked about in previous episodes. And I've also used a pendulum to connect to that core, bypassing the mind, to that collective consciousness, or that divinity within, however you want to look at it. And I've been to allergists using a cuff, where the cuff measures the pressure on an arm. So they were like, one person had, the person being tested had their arm out and they had a cuff on, and the allergist was pushing on the cuff. So to have the pressure be the same each time, and they would move a different substance in, and you go weak if you're allergic to it.
Have you ever had a chiropractor, Jeff, that's used kinesiology with you?
I have. Yeah, I have. But the scaling is really, so helpful. I mean, just when you're looking at comparing, say, two different foods, or for us, comparing two different fields of consciousness, to really know, wow, this one's 10 times higher. It's a point higher. And it's really how we developed FLFE, was being able to measure the effects, and also measuring what's the optimal level, for a house to be. Part of our mission there is supporting the evolution of consciousness in an economized society where you're going to work and paying your rent or mortgage. And, so testing that kind of sweet spot level where if the environment was really high, say it was in the 600s or 700s, up in those non-linear enlightenment stages, do you really want to get up and go to work? It's like, does it matter? So one of the keys for me also I was so fascinated when you taught me this, and when we first started talking about Dr. Hawkins, was this non-linear or non-local, so this chiropractor and the allergist, that was all local, where it's, they're testing me and we're standing together in the same room. But David Hawkins discovered it's non-local, this quantum connection where you can test the truth of something, which might be the level of consciousness of a field across the planet in, Sweden at a particular address, that we can test the level of consciousness of that field. And it comes back to the quantum connection we've talked about in previous episodes, like that, which is examples of twins and mother and children, where there's that instant connection, that there's this kinesiology, non-local. How did you first start to use that, back in the early days of using? I know in early days of FLFE, kind of before we started FLFE, you were looking at different areas, like raising consciousness in different areas.
Yeah, I mean, if for those of you who are interested in the history of kinesiology, you can go back to Dr. George Goodhart. He was really well known for his kind of local phenomena experiments. And when I read Power versus Force, based upon the recommendation of my clients in my coaching practice, what I started thinking was, well, if you can measure someone's level of consciousness, then you can probably measure it in a certain part of their life. Mm-hmm. And so I developed assessments measuring people in about 10 different parts of their life. And that's where we started to make really big gains with people who had these parts of themselves that they weren't maybe acknowledging how low it was, or they didn't know. And then we were able to measure the level of appropriateness of different tools to help them raise their consciousness.
Yeah, I was one of those people.
It was a great tool.
Yeah, I was a client of yours then, and boy, that was a great tool. It's like to find those parts of my consciousness that were low, aspects of my consciousness, which correspond to the lines that Ken Wilber uses. So it's really interesting to me when you started doing that, because I'd already was familiar with, okay, there's different aspects of us, that are, some might be high, some might be low. And finding those low spots where I was low in consciousness, where there was like an unacknowledged or unaccepted or unloved, part of myself. And I remember doing some work with you on my father and that relationship side, relationship aspect of my consciousness. And which really, really made a difference in my life.
Yeah, we all had those places in our life that we're working on, and sometimes we're typically conscious that there's an issue, but we may not know we calibrate at 180 out of 1,000 in that area of our life, or we calibrate at 150 or 210. And to see the contrast between that area and some area where you're 600 or 700, the evidence is peppered throughout our life. It's really there in the reality of day-to-day living. If we can measure the influence and support the person to see the outward evidence. If the person wants to change, it makes it a lot easier to do so. It's harder to hide. It's harder to hide out in your own story when the evidence is all over your life.
Yeah. And it could be in your physical body too, like ailments and pains. And we've discovered since, we work together as, client and coach, consciousness coach in FLFE, that in a high consciousness field, that these things start to move, that we're supported to rise in all those areas. And that's why, people go to pilgrimage sites and they go to, church or the synagogue or the mosque, and they pray, or they are with a group of people that have a good intent, that we start to rise in those areas. Or as we talked about last time, we're around someone with a field of consciousness that is really high in a certain aspect. Like if you're 990 in financial management, being around somebody like that then helps your own level of consciousness and financial management to go up. So being in those high fields is really helpful for this evolution of consciousness we're talking about.
Yeah, if a person's high enough, it's traditionally known as the grace of the guru. Mm-hmm. And the people in the personal development field would acknowledge that you're most like the 5 people you spend time around, or whatever the number is that different people say. It's different numbers of influences, but we're definitely affected by those around us, and the environments we're in at home, in the office, and even in society at large. I mean, obviously 2020 was a rough year, and the world went to its lowest level of consciousness in April. Probably for that month, it hadn't been that low since the Dark Ages, 1300s or something like that. We'll talk about that in a future episode as well. We've done the last 3,000 years of the level of consciousness of the planet, and we'll run it right up to the current day and show you some of the changes that the Earth has been going through from that point of view. And this whole consciousness thing and muscle testing, kinesiology, is, if you want to try for yourself, it's really easy. You can just get an envelope with some artificial sweetener, like Sweet and Low, and you can put not that brown sugar is a great food, but some brown sugar in an envelope. Most people will test positive for brown sugar, and most people literally all people will test negative for artificial sweeteners. So you can play around with that, just hold it in front of your body and just see if your body wants to move towards it or back from it. I just wanted to leave you with something that is really simple, where you can just go into your fridge and start trying things out.
Mm-hmm. So being aware of these fields of consciousness and how they affect us, something we've been talking about. And what we mentioned last week was thoughts, that these thoughts that we think we are thinking, we think they are our thoughts, that they may be coming from the environment, from the field of consciousness, whether they're kind of collective societal size thoughts, or, thought forms, or they're related to some local event or something that happened at a place. So that was kind of the takeaway, or the final practical tip that we had last week was, is this thought my thought? So since the last episode, what have you had any thoughts that you realized weren't your thoughts, Clayton?
Yeah, well, there was. I'm up in British Columbia, in a small town called Nelson, in the mountains, where the head office of FLFE is, and right now we have a lot of smoke in the air because of some local fires. We've had a really dry June, and we're halfway through July now, 2021. And when you have those local fires, there's a lot of ash in the air, a lot of smoke. And there was a little town here locally called Lytton, locally, 600 miles away. Canada's a big country. Local is, 500-600 miles. The town burnt down. And there's been forest fires here in the past, just like there's been large ones here in California and other places. And when the smoke started to come into town, and it's been here for a few days, I noticed my level of kind of fear start to amp up about what could happen. So what's occurring is that there's smoke in the air. And the story in my mind is that there's going to be fires that are going to, damage property and kill people, et cetera, et cetera. And so all those thoughts, I determined, well, the exaggerated fear thoughts were from the collective consciousness of all the people that are afraid of fires. Mm-hmm. They really weren't my thoughts. Mm-hmm. I mean, the evidence is there's smoke in the air and some ash, and that's it. And there's reasonable precautions you can take. But the story of how the fires might hurt people, those weren't my thoughts. That was from the collective mm-hmm. consciousness. So, and you got a story too, don't you, Jeff?
I was at a county fair this last weekend, and you go to a county fair, and they're kind of similar everywhere, and I just had the thought to have a creamy whip, right? Have an ice cream. And Audrey's like, right on board. Yeah, let's do that. And we're walking past fried dough and all sorts of, just really bad for you
corn
things
dogs
to eat.
And
corn dogs.
Donut holes, yeah.
Corn dogs were definitely there on the list. Yeah. And the thought was, yeah, let's eat it. Stop here. Get out the money. It was the thought form of eating those like quote unquote treats as part of the experience of being there at the county fair. And so, when I checked later, no, that wasn't my thought. And I think we checked when you and I talked about it, it wasn't my biome, it wasn't like Candida's talking either. It was, the thought form in that, maybe on that land, because that county fair is there every year. There's the vendors. It was the last day of the fair, and they were like, okay, we got to sell out our ice cream mix. And, so, and all the people that were there. So there was those thought forms that came in. And so, and, another example is going to watch a movie, and you got to have popcorn, right? It's like the popcorn thought is just such a strong thought. It's really hard to resist it.
Yeah, you got to be really clear about what you're going to eat and what you're not going to eat when going to a theater. Otherwise, yeah.
Yeah, and a county fair.
and a county fair, yes. I think those are the challenges that people have when they go on, and they try to change their eating habits, right?
Yeah. Yeah, and you've got those thought forms talking to you.
Yeah.
So Clayton, what are some examples in your experience of higher consciousness thoughts replacing, for instance, the fear thought about fire? What would be a higher consciousness thought?
Well, in that example, the thought that I consciously chose was, I am safe in this moment, and I will take reasonable precautions. And, I tend to be a bit of a technical, that's a pretty technical, scientific, geeky type of thought, but that's, that's usually where I go to. It's kind of that little scientist in me that, has these resources in terms of thoughts. But that's what I said in that case. Did you have one for the creamy whip or is there some other one you want to mention?
Well, that one would be interesting. I mean, for me, it's taking care of my body and giving food to my body that really helps it to be healthy and to evolve. So, I think the thought I would put in is, I'm healthy and I eat healthy food for my body.
Yeah.
And then there's that negative self-talk, that comes up, lock the keys in the car. Boy, I'm an idiot. Replacing with, I made a mistake and I'm resourceful and we'll find a way to get the car open.
Yes. Yeah, those are good times to be conscious of the momentum that can happen when you're hard on yourself. Mm-hmm. And my favorite go-to all-around thought, replacement thought, is I love and accept myself just the way I am.
Wasn't that a song?
Well, if it isn't, it should be. Well, love is all you need.
No, it's just
that one.
No, it's just the way you are. Yeah. Great.
Yeah, there's some standard ones like that. Another one is I forgive myself, everyone, and everything involved in this experience, and I release it to my higher power for healing now.
That's great.
So that's another one and that's 1,000 of 1,000. That one.
That's like a universal wrench for of positive thoughts.
Yeah, that's true enough. Yeah, that's the adjustable. That wrench will fit any nut.
So occasionally in these podcasts, we'll talk about 1,000 out of 1,000 phrase. So this is calibrating the truth of a statement. And when it's 1,000 out of 1,000, that's just, that's at the top. And it's really fun to take those or take a phrase and measure the level of consciousness of it, and then, kind of turn it into the 1,000 out of 1,000 phrase. And we're starting a list of those. So the one relating to this, we talked about in a previous podcast: don't believe every thought that you experience. So that's 1,000 out of 1,000. And what it started from was don't believe everything you think. And I think that one was around 600 or so, Clayton. Yeah. Well, when you were talking about the fear of the fire, and I was thinking about the craving of the ice cream, it was more of an experience than a thought. It was a feeling. There was like a feeling and emotion attached to the thought. So it makes sense to me that don't believe every thought that you experience would be higher, because sometimes it's not like a thought, but it's more of an experience of a feeling.
Yeah, there's a kind of a visceral, physical, like knot in your stomach or something like that. So yeah, there's typically a logical sequence of refinement that you will be able to discern when you go from, say, a 400 truth to a 600 truth, a 600 out of 1,000 truth, to 1,000 of 1,000 truth. So we're just trying to give you an example of that type of reasoning. Yeah.
Yeah, we'll do some more of those in future episodes.
Yeah. So 1,000 of 1,000 means the ultimate truth. It's the highest truth available in that context. So if we're looking at the context of the thoughts that you think, reframing it to the thoughts you experience is another way of revealing a higher truth, because the thought just isn't in the cranium or in the brain. It's, can affect our whole being.
Yeah. So it is really a higher truth. And I tend to think of it too, like when we measure something that's in the 400s, which is more reason, kind of scientific materialism, like, where North America is normally 410 or so, 420. And then as the truth moves up into the 600s and above, that it gets more including of the nonlinear, or kind of what's underneath reality as we know it, perhaps. And then as we get, higher and higher, it's even more and more true in a lot of ways.
Yeah, so I guess our takeaway this week, or the opportunity for you to practice being a consciousness researcher yourself, is to pay attention to where you're having these thoughts, in which environments, and remember that you can always choose a higher consciousness thought. So it's a bit of a thought management technique where you can have a thought about the the ash in the air or the smoke in the air in my case and what it might mean. And if you're paying attention, you can realize that your mind wants to make a story up about that. And the evidence is only that there's ash in the air, and maybe take some reasonable precautions, but don't let fear run the rest of your day.
Mm-hmm. And knowing that certain environments, may have thoughts waiting for you, as we've said, just being aware of that. So once those thoughts occur, then what would the technique or thought management technique be once you notice you have, say, you could call it a negative thought, or a thought you don't really want to have?
Well, this is like a whole hour discussion, but typically what I do is I'll say to myself, cancel that thought. And then,
mm-hmm.
Some people joke in the social situation, they'll say something kind of negative, on purpose, then they go cancel,
Mm-hmm.
So I typically say to myself, cancel that thought, or I'll just recognize internally that's likely not my thought. And then I can use
mm-hmm.
kinesiology, because I'm pretty well practiced at it, to determine where it's coming from. And then I'll just replace it with another thought. It's like, in the case of the fire, I'm going to take, I'm going to have a plan for our household. If there's a big fire in town, that we all know what's happening. We know where our passports are. We're going to get our documents in a backpack, and if we have to grab it and go, then we know where everything is.
Mm-hmm. And there are those negative self thoughts, like self-judgment thoughts that can show up. It's patterning from childhood, or might be societal as well. But having that negative self thought, like, oh, I always make mistakes, or there I go again making a mistake, or catching those, and then having a positive, higher consciousness thought, a loving thought, or a forgiveness thought if it's about someone else, or even yourself. Yeah, forgiving yourself.
It's a big topic. I mean, we're going to spend a lot of time on this in the future. We just wanted to open the door to you today and connect it to the idea of high consciousness fields. In a high consciousness field, you don't have very many negative thoughts.
Mm-hmm.
It's just the nature of the field. And in the low consciousness field, there's a different type of thinking that goes on.
Mm-hmm. So step one is awareness, and step two then would be choosing, a higher consciousness or a more positive thought.
Yeah.
And I think, another aspect of that is also paying attention in your body, because as we've said, it can show up in your body rather than a thought. So it might be like a craving or a knot in your stomach, as you said. So where is it in your body? May also be information as you to develop your awareness of thoughts that are coming in that aren't yours.
That's a good point. Many people discern it in their physical body before they recognize it in their head, if you will. Yeah, that's very true.
Well, in the next episode, we'll get deeper into low and high consciousness fields, and we've talked about some of that today and how that can really affect you. So it'd be great to get into more detail and really talk about kind of examples of those and where you might run into those around the world.
Thank you for joining Fields of Consciousness, the podcast of consciousness conversations. We invite you to visit the link below the episode to experience a completely free trial of Focused Life Force Energy for 15 days. This is a big part in our life's work, our goal being to support the optimal conditions for the evolution of consciousness in an economized society.
FLFE creates a pristine, loving, energetic environment for people to thrive in. It's our free gift to you, no credit card required. So we invite you to subscribe to this Fields of Consciousness podcast and tune in next time. We release new episodes every other week on Tuesdays at 11 a.m. PST. onward and upward.